Good afternoon and welcome to the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. We're very excited today to have another installment of Conversations with Dr. Tony. Today's topic is Reimagining Youth Suicide Prevention with Dr. Pamela Morris. And before I hand it over to Tony to get us started with our conversation, just wanted to check in with everybody around the webinar platform. By now, I'm sure everybody's very familiar with Zoom, but just as a reminder, everybody is currently muted. Please use that chat box, and we strongly encourage you to use that chat box actually to submit any questions or comments you have as you hear the conversation. And we'll probably also have some time at the end to answer any questions from the audience as well. We are recording today's webinar, and it will be posted on the ctacny.org website within 2 to 3 business days. At the end of the webinar, you'll also see a link for a feedback survey. We strongly encourage you to complete that evaluation and give us any information you can about today's webinar, as well as any interest in future offerings as well, as we do really look at that feedback pretty closely. So without further ado, Tony, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lydia. I really appreciate that. Just welcome everyone. I'm Tony Salerno, and our topic today is one that's a very serious topic, and one that I think is a critical topic around reimagining youth suicide prevention. Now, my role at McSilver Institute is I'm an innovation implementation officer. I guess what that really comes down to is when you have like really great ideas, how do you actually turn those ideas into action? And that's really where the tough work is. And today I think it may stimulate our thinking around what is it that we can do in whatever role that we have to apply what you'll be hearing from Dr. Pamela Morris. And we're really just thrilled to have her. She has a really important story to share with us and a way of kind of thinking about our work and about ways of addressing this really serious issue of youth suicide in a way that for me, and I shared this with Dr. Morris, really stretched my thinking. And I think it'll do that for you as well. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Morris. She's a professor of applied psychology at NYU, the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, an affiliated professor at the NYU School of Global Public Health. And she's an interdisciplinary scholar, which really means conducting research at the intersection of developmental psychology, suicidology, education, and policy in collaboration with economists, policy analysts, implementation scientists, behavioral pediatricians, and prevention scientists. So as you can see, there's like many different angles to the work that Dr. Morris is involved in. The newest research addresses adolescent suicide from a developmentally informed and a population health perspective. With the prediction of suicide barely better than chance, she focuses on the places where adolescents are, right? Where kids live, in schools and primary care, and where they can leverage their trusted sources of support, peers, parents, and other adults. So as a suicide loss survivor, having lost her 17-year-old daughter, Frankie, to suicide in 2019, she brings lived experience to her work on youth suicide prevention. So that very unique perspective, which is rare. And I think that's something that we can really very much benefit from, and why we're so appreciative that Dr. Morris is here today to share her perspective with us. She's a former William T. Grant Scholar. She served as the lead editor of the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness and a member of the National Academy of Sciences on Children, Youth, and Families. She received her bachelor's degree from Columbia and a doctorate in developmental psychology from Cornell University. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Morris with us. Hi, Dr. Morris.
Hi, Dr. Tony.
So pleased to have you. I just want to let folks know that we don't want them to be too passive in this process, that, we have the chat box. Please share your comments, reactions, questions, issues that you'd like to share with others, because people can relate to this topic in so many different ways. So we invite you to do so. Some of your comments we'll be able to respond to, and some of the questions perhaps some others we may not, but we'll do our very best. So let's get started. So before we go further, Dr. Morris, I want to say, first of all, I think from McSilver Institute, really sharing our heartfelt condolences around your loss, and so the appreciation that you wanted to share your experience in a way that could be helpful to other families, so that they can avoid the pain that's associated with type of loss. And I just wanted to ask you is there anything that we should know about your daughter that really helps us to better understand and appreciate your experience and perhaps your inspiration to begin to share what was such a deeply intimate personal experience, and really in a way that could be helpful to others?
Yeah, thank you for asking and thank you for the thoughts. Yeah, so as I spoke about in my New York Times piece, we lost our 17-year-old daughter, Frankie was her name, to suicide. It was 3 weeks before her high school graduation. It was back in June of 2019, so just over 2 years ago now. And she was just, this incredibly warm and empathic, affectionate girl, incredibly well connected to others. I always think her teenage friends sort of were some of the best at sort of describing who she was. And they spoke, of the ways in which she'd sort of jingle her way into rooms. She had this very eclectic earring collection. Those are her earrings, actually. They spoke of, being embraced with abandon by her. She would sort of snuggle into them and, stick her nose in their necks and sort of literally inhale them. And I think what's surprising about her story to others was that here was a girl who was incredibly connected to other kids, and she could make other kids feel so special and seen, and adults too, for that matter, and yet still could struggle so profoundly underneath all of that. In terms of how she guides my way forward, I in all of this today and every day, I really try to channel her strength. She had this sort of extraordinary light that I think transcended her own emotional struggles and helped, give her the strength to, engage with school and theater every day. And I try to sort of channel that as I go through my own grief process, which is, long and arduous. And I'm also really propelled by her commitment to helping others. Even after she had sort of become much more open about her own struggles, which were hidden for a fair bit of time, when she became open about them, she really encouraged other kids to open up as well. So if another kid were struggling and saying, I'm really wondering if it's all worth it, she would be like, you don't keep it a secret. You've got to go find someone. You've got to start talking about it. And so for my work as a loss survivor, I feel like this is sort of carrying on her legacy. It's really important work to keep doing in her honor.
As when I was reading your article, I was beginning to say to myself, because I have 3 children, and I began to say, gee, what could be underneath what seems on the outside, like, kids involved in this, the kids involved in that, they got friends and all of this. And yet inside there could be like a lot of angst, a lot of turmoil going on, and you wouldn't know it, right? Or you attribute it to just, of course, teenagers, right? And you kind of like figure that way. And that's one of the things that I was sort of like thinking about, that if we're waiting to see something for kids, oh, that's the sign, right? That's it, right? That may not be the way to go. And what are your thoughts about about that? The family folks and folks who are on this right now might be saying, who have kids, right, might be saying, well, gee, how does one know, and what does one do?
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I mean, certainly we should know what the signs are and all be educated to recognize the signs. That said, there are a lot of kids that don't show those signs, or frankly, it's just impossible, as you were sort of articulating, to distinguish between what sort of normal teenage, challenges and what is really serious suicidal thinking and risk. And I think as a parent, we are absolutely not educated to tell the difference. I frankly am not convinced that a lot of people can tell the difference for some kids. And what I learned and I think was so important to understand as I sort of got into this was just how prevalent suicidal thinking is. And I spoke about this a bit, but if, 1 in 5 high schoolers seriously think about it, nearly 1 in 6 high schoolers have made a suicide plan, and nearly 1 in 10 kids have made an attempt in the last year when we interview them. Those numbers, that means 2 to 3 kids in every high school class. That means if it's not your kid, it's probably a kid they know incredibly well, probably a kid that's been in and out of your house. And so if that's the case, then we all have to get really good at not just recognizing the signs, but asking directly about it as well. And that's a message that I absolutely want to have out there, that it's okay to ask, but that we should all be asking a lot more often.
Kelly just sort of like commented that with her own daughter who may be like joking about killing herself and things like that. And then, you as kids are, right? You then want to go, oh, let's talk more about it. And then kids that they usually do is shrug it off, minimize, say it was nothing, that kind of a thing. So, how does one, I mean, it really is a tough thing, right? This is quite a challenge of being able to establish a means of communication. And sometimes it may not just be resting on the family, right? It could be the kid is like the last one they want to talk to about this, might be a family member. That's what I'm kind of like thinking. I don't know if that makes sense, Dr. Morris, what I'm saying, but because I think one of your main points is it really can't fall upon any particular set of shoulders.
Right.
Shoulders really need to be almost like a community.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, every kid will find their trusted person, and that could be often for teenagers, it would be a friend, right? Yeah. So our job then is to make ourselves available as adults to those friends, right, as well. But sometimes it's going to be a teacher, that they've got a especially close relationship. Sometimes it would be a parent. Sometimes it might be a religious leader or a pediatrician. We all sort of have a role to be open to the conversation. The way I sort of see it is, like any hard conversation you have with your kids, right? About, sex, drugs, right? You pick it, right? Hard topics. It's really about setting the table for the conversation. It's about sort of acknowledging that you're open to it. So if the kid is joking about it and you can say, and shrugs it off, you can say, I just want you to know that if you have a moment that you are thinking seriously about it and want to talk to somebody, that might be me, or I will help you find somebody else to talk to about it.
Right.
And it's calmly talking about it the way we talk about kids' stomach aches. I was explaining to somebody how when I was a kid, like we used to know the difference between asking a kid like if they had a stomach ache versus when it was an appendicitis, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be like, where does it hurt? How much does it hurt? Does it hurt on the, what is it, the right side, I think, with an appendicitis or something like that? Are you, do you also have a fever accompanying it? We knew enough questions to ask to distinguish those two things. Those are the kinds of questions we should be asking about suicidal thinking as well.
What reminds me, Dr. Morris, is that with kids, oftentimes it's just keeping the lines open might be the most important goal, right? Is that because we can respond in ways that kind of shut kids down, I think, right? I think what you're suggesting is giving kids that opportunity, let them know that you're there for them, that, that you're open to listening. You're not afraid of anything that they have to say, which is the other part of it, I think, because it seems to be like an area that can be so scary to even bring up. I don't think I've ever brought that up at all with any of my kids, to be just frank, right? I'm a psychologist, right? A clinical psychologist. I never even would think about like bringing it up unless there was some real problems that were staring me in the face. And so I'm sure that's because I think that's one of the messages there is to destigmatize this and get this to be less of a, the word that cannot be spoken. The thing so scary. Do I have it right in terms of what you think, where we think we need to go?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that if we ask the question, we will put the idea in the kid's head. We will glamorize it in some way. We will otherwise actually make them start thinking about it. And there's actually been incredibly careful research to say that's absolutely not the case, that we don't put the idea in somebody's head, right? And I think about it like cancer was 50 years ago, right? My parents' generation would be like, he has cancer. Right. And that is absolutely the conversations that used to occur, or HIV AIDS 30 years ago, right? No one right? Silence equals death is the saying for HIV AIDS, right? It's the same thing here. I think, we're not having the conversations because we are all too scared to open up about it. I mean, and for good reason. It involves death, which as a society certainly, and, is something incredibly scary to talk about, but it's also sort of fundamentally something that, so most of us, I think, don't understand, frankly, don't really want to understand, not because we're bad people, but just because it's frightening. It's really frightening. What is interesting is actually when you start being somebody who's open to it, as we've become in our family because we were open from the moment it happened, about what happened, and because people know now we're engaged with it in sort of a very sort of regular way. People come to us a lot. So I've had friends come and talk to me about their own suicidal thinking. I've had colleagues come talk to me about their kids or their friends. And it's amazing to me where all those people who did they go to before I was the person that they were going to? Because it is around me a lot now because I'm open to it. Friends I've had for years and years and years, we've never talked about it, but now we do. And I think that's what happens when you become open, because there's so few people that are open. And I'd like it to be more open in more houses and more schools and more places.
Well, you mentioned the prevalence, and I know that this is an issue actually at McSilver, and our director, Dr. Michael Lindsay, who was very much in the space of, with the Congressional Black Caucus when they did a review of the statistics on especially Black young boys and teens, that the rate has been increasing, and they're kind of like sounding the alarm. Have a report around that. There was an article in Pediatrics in November 2019, again, really focusing on, looking at the prevalence, and it's really, really alarming what's happening in certain, communities, particularly teens of people of color who are really young, children and teens. And so where are we with this, what's going on? Do we have a sense of, is this problem increasing? Are there factors that may be contributing to it? You have some sense of what's going on around that?
I mean, so the rates have been rising for quite a while now. I mean, they've certainly not gone down, and they've been rising for the last 15, 20 years among young people. And as you mentioned, Michael Lindsay's work is incredibly important. He's shown that there's sort of a rising rate of suicide attempts among Black youth in particular, and especially high rate for coming from some other work for 10 to 14-year-old Black children as well. Their rates are, just a couple of other statistics to know, are very high for, attempt rates are incredibly high for LGBTQ plus kids. They are actually one of the highest rates of attempts. Why the rates are going up, I think there's lots of thoughts, but I don't think people really know, honestly. I think the most discouraging thing is there's been a lot of work being done over the last 20 years, and those rates are still climbing despite the work that's happening, despite the fact that kids are more open to talking about mental health issues, despite the fact that stigma has been to some extent reduced relative to was 30 years ago, right? Despite a lot of research on new evidence-based strategies for addressing mental health. So I think that's the biggest conundrum. Some people will blame social media. We also know there's good pieces of social media as well as bad, right? People will blame, all kinds of culprits. And honestly, we don't, like I said, we don't know. And in fact, predicting, and I report this in my piece, predicting death by suicide is no greater than chance right now. So over the last 50 years, we've been doing research, and we can't figure out whether it's this kid that will die versus that kid. And that's a huge problem. And that's argues to me, it's why I started going down this road of thinking about a public health approach, is that if you can't predict the who and its the precursors, i.e. suicidal thinking and attempts, right? The most risky precursors, right? Thinking about it and attempting are much more prevalent than I think we acknowledge, then we've got to start getting a lot more people involved.
Well, I think the tendency, at least that was certainly my kind of like way of thinking of it, is, gee, if you want to solve this, right, you want to address it, like expand mental health services, right?
Mhm.
The idea that it's the mental health system, is access, is quality, the skill of practitioners, the ability to assess risk, having a whole variety, a continuum of interventions that you could use, those sorts of things. That's where I think typically, I think a lot of us go to our own industry. Everyone who's on right now, there's like maybe over 300 people who are on, and most will represent the behavioral healthcare system, right? And really want to learn more about how they can, address some of these sorts of issues. But you have a little bit of a different take on it. It's going to really take a lot more than any particular service sector if we are going to approach this in a way that's going to have meaningful impact and that public health kind of perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about your vision of what we need to do as a society to take this on really seriously and put a really big dent into these problems?
Yeah, thank you for that. First of all, there's really important work going on the mental health side. So I just want to applaud everybody who's working already in the mental health field, who are doing Herculean work in this area, because it's tough work. It's not funded well enough. There's not enough folks doing it. It's incredibly important. I will say that I think the biggest shame is you're all doing it alone, right? You're trying to carry this weight of doing all of it entirely by yourselves. And that's, I think, where the biggest gap is. So what I spoke about, the way I sort of talk about this, and I think the easiest way to sort of think about sort of a new world of suicide prevention is to think about actually universal seatbelt safety. The story that I tell in my piece is that I was driving in my car, which I don't do terribly. I live in the lower part of Manhattan, so I'm not in a car terribly often. I saw a sign that said "Click it or ticket," which is a public health campaign for seatbelts. And I looked into sort of the history of seatbelt safety. And it turns out that it actually began back in the 80s when I was a teenager, as I age myself on air. Back in the 80s, it turns out that seatbelt use was incredibly low, right? About 15% of Americans at the time used seatbelts. But actually, adults were very worried about teenagers because they were inexperienced drivers dying in car accidents, and they couldn't figure out which kid would get into an accident, which one wouldn't. And the one tool they had, which were seatbelts, were used, by very, a limited number of the population. I actually recall we used to have this game we played in the back of our car where we would, fly all over the back seat as my mom turned corners. When you look at what we do now for seatbelt safety, right, we don't wait for one group of professionals to tell us to put on a seatbelt, right? We don't wait to get a ticket for it, right? Car companies embed those warning signs, right? The beeping sounds. If you don't put on your seatbelt right away, you learn about it in driver's ed as your first lessons, right? You're going to fail your driver's ed test if you don't put on your seatbelt immediately. So you get the muscle memory of it anyway. The car beeping reminds you if you inadvertently forget one day. We still have those click it or ticket signs on the highway. They were there until the mask signs have been up more lately, but certainly continue to be part of the National Highway Safety Campaign public service announcements. And so basically the idea in seatbelt safety, which is how we got to 90% seatbelt use, was that everybody was involved, like private companies, right? The car companies, driver's education, so training institutions, public agencies like the National Highway Safety Campaign. all came together to actually get people to put on their seatbelts. And we have things that we know do keep kids safe. And we also have things that we think could help to help kids in crisis. And those two things are what help keep kids safe are keeping them away from lethal means, from ways to have to result from a suicide attempt to result in death. And those are things like lock boxes for medications. There's one-at-a-time pill packaging for medications that also have been shown to be highly effective. There was a wonderful study done in the UK about one-at-a-time pill packaging, right? So you have to pop them out one at a time, much less likely to take them all at once. Obviously, firearm safety, many of us know about as well. And yet none of that information is getting into the hands of families. So pediatricians could be counseling families on that when kids are, reaching their 11th and 12-year-old, 10, 11, 12-year-old checkups. There's a hotline, there's a national suicide hotline at 800-273-8255 and a text line 741-741, all of which will become, at least the hotline will become 988 in a year's time. And people should know that those numbers the way we know about 911. Those are numbers I didn't know about until I started studying suicide prevention. So all of those things are components of what would be sort of a much more universal system for suicide prevention than what we have right now. Because right now, unfortunately, all of you who are working in the mental health field are working all by yourselves, and to both identify kids and treat them. And that work still has to happen, but I want to help kids get to you faster. And then I also want to help to provide wraparound support so that when kids leave your offices, they also have support from a whole bunch of other people around them as well.
So what you're saying is so important, because think of how many kids never even get anywhere near within 100 feet of a mental health program. But I don't think there's one kid who doesn't see a pediatrician.
Yeah.
And so, we're really talking about an entire community that can play a role. I was a high school teacher and a guidance counselor, and I have to tell you, our school wouldn't typically think that we have like a role to play in addressing, self-harm risk and depression and those sorts of things. We're trying to figure out how to get these kids graduated on time, that kind of thing. And so, but your vision, if you could share more of it, is that there's a role for really many, many different community entities to play in addressing this issue. And as you're saying, so that the behavioral health system doesn't appear to be the only one that has to, address this and try to do it all on our own. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it is, right. So, a wonderful pediatrician who saw my piece out in, I think she was in Cincinnati, wrote to me and said, we used to just screen for depression. And then those who are at risk, we would talk to them about gun safety in their homes. We'd find out whether they needed, the family had a gun in their home and needed firearm safety support. She said, after I read your piece, I am realizing we need to be screening for suicide risk among kids starting at the age of 10. B, we need to be doing it we need to be talking to every family about safety in their home, irrespective of the risk, because risk a kid cannot be at risk today, but could be at risk a month from now, right? And the kid is not back in the pediatrician's office for maybe another year. So now's a moment when you have their attention that you can talk to them and share information. So she's starting a pilot now of where she's going to be doing full safety information for families from a pediatrician's office, essentially, from every kid she sees, as so that it's sort of the first start of it all, right? So that we know we can keep kids safe as much as possible, but also then try to help families know what to do to connect them to care so they can get the help they need earlier. So one of the most surprising statistics to me was how long kids wait to get into treatment. I think I heard estimates of something like 6 or 8 years often before they even get near a mental health, appropriate mental health services. So it's some of that, but it's not just that, right? It's also, for some kids, they're going to find their church is where they really feel connected and need the information to be shared with them, or their synagogue or their after school club, right? Or their school. And we need to really offer tools to these places so they can offer, so that they can really support kids wherever they are in whatever this process, and really connect them, really be an important connector to services, right? So that everybody is much more engaged in this as well.
And in many ways, what you're saying is that what starts out like an innovation, such as seatbelts, becomes routine.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't become like, it's like a lot of energy, time, and effort that goes into it, which is the case in the beginning, right? In the beginning, there is a lot of that. But at some point where it just becomes, just part of the way in which people do business, whether it's schools, the healthcare, pediatrics, someone, Aisha, sort of chatted in that one of the concerns is, and maybe a concern of this issue of risk, right? And how systems respond to risk. And so if a pediatrics office, a kid even makes a hint about any kind of self-harm, off to the ER type of thing, that kind of issue. And I wonder like how we can sort of address that so that there isn't, there's a little more confidence in being able to not have like as soon as there's even a slight indication of a problem, way to address liability and risk is to pass it off to, like someone else. Is that something you think is likely to be encountered that would need to be addressed at some point?
Yeah, and I think it has to be addressed on both sides, right? So on the one hand, I think this is also what's stopping kids from revealing suicidal thinking as well, right? They are scared they're going to be locked up, right? They're scared, and for all kids, this is incredibly scary. I think especially for, BIPOC kids or LGBTQ plus kids who may not have gotten culturally sensitive care, it can be even scarier if that's possible. So yeah, I think it's a real issue with regard to how do we create a space where kids can talk about what they're thinking, and either because of, worries about liability or, just misunderstanding, that we sort of pair that with appropriate response. There is really good guidance on under what conditions a kid really does need to be in an inpatient unit, in a fully supervised unit, and when they don't. And clinicians know that better than the lay person. But there is guidance on all of that for one. So some of the screening tools do a really good job at sort of identifying not just like at elevated risk, but does the kid, there are follow-up questions that can be asked. Does the kid have a plan? Do they, et cetera. I don't want to go into all the details in this conversation,
Right.
but I think that is, I do think that we need to educate not just on the kind of openness of the conversation, but the what to do afterwards, right? And those resources. And I think you're right. I think places, especially those that are less well-skilled at dealing with acute risk, are going to be, are going to need the education in terms of under what conditions is it appropriate to be sending a kid to an inpatient unit, and under what conditions are different form of follow-up care. What's interesting is actually some of the helpline actually is you can actually call it as a parent to find out information. Like, I'm worried about this person. I'm worried about my kid. I'm worried about my kid's friend. My kid is worried about their friend. And you can call the line and ask for advice about when and where should I be worried. And those folks, those who answer the crisis lines, can actually help you evaluate that a little bit and give you support as well. And that's another piece of the puzzle that I think that many people don't know, is that these lines are also kind of informational lines as well. But yeah, I think that's a huge challenge.
I was wondering because, there may be other barriers as well. And to you know, let's say really moving towards this vision that you have, right, of public health, many community entities, really assuming some responsibility to keep our children safe, you know, as you're saying. Do you have a sense of what other barriers are likely to happen that we just need to be aware of, and that this could be, you know, one of the things to consider in making that, you know, that vision into a reality?
Yeah. I mean, I think this question of liability is a really good one. I also think that there are really clear guidelines around safe messaging around suicide deaths, but also just around suicide more generally. That, you know, under what conditions is it okay to talk about? What resources should you offer? How do you talk about it? How do you talk about it in the paper? Most of these have been around media presentations. And I think what's happened with those is when we've, because there have been very clear guardrails, and there have been really now very well developed, the National Action Alliance and others have developed these wonderful information sets that are for media and for others who want to talk about suicide, about how to do it in a way that's actually going to be not what we call iatrogenic, right? Not create more risk than existed already, and actually might actually be part of suicide prevention, right? Might actually help. And the way you do that is you do not, you know, there are specifics about suicidal attempts that you don't provide. You don't want to, you know, glamorize a suicide death in any way. But at the same time, saying it's a suicide itself is not doing that. So I just will say that it is okay to talk about a suicide death. And it's also okay, and people have argued that one of the most important pieces is to pair a conversation around suicide with also a conversation around how people who've struggled with suicidality have actually gotten to the other side of it, right? Have actually, I will use somebody else's term called live through this. So there's this wonderful suicide attempt survivor whose name is Desiree Stage, does remarkable work. Where she tells the stories of it's a photojournalist kind of effort where she tells the stories of suicide attempt survivors. But in doing so, I think she shares stories of hope and strength in that community. And I think it's sharing those that also are part of the ways in which we get from challenge to prevention, risk to prevention, really. So it's really about showing kids hopeful ways in which they can actually enact change, both for themselves, for their friends, and for those around them that are struggling, and be part of that process. There's actually wonderful programs that actually try to really scaffold that process as well for kids, and we've been really excited to find some of those as well.
Could you say a little more about in some of these programs, what are some of the things that they do to kind of promote a sense of hopefulness about the future, confidence that you can kind of get through really difficult times, those sorts of things? Anything in particular that kind of stood out for you in some of these programs?
Yeah. There's one that we're working with in California that is one of my favorites. And it's my favorite, I think, because as a developmentalist, it speaks to sort of developmental, it really touches on a whole set of developmental issues, but also it's one that I think my daughter and her friends would have loved to be part of. So it's something called Directing Change, directingchange.org. They're a California-based program. They call themselves Suicide Prevention Disguised as a Film Contest. So it's a film contest in California. It's been running for about 9 years now, where kids create 30 and 60-second films in suicide prevention or mental health awareness. And I think what's interesting about it is they're making films, so it's a very active, participatory activity, right? They're not just watching a video on suicide prevention. In the films, they, talk about, recognizing the signs, finding a trusted adult, and the suicide prevention hotline and text line so that there's a resource. And then they show these films. So the kids make the films in film class. Sometimes they show them to their school communities. They show them to their parents. And then judges in the communities, they take community members to become judges of these films as a way to sort of spread the knowledge about suicide prevention around the community as well. And sometimes the films are even shown in local theaters, as part of, preview scenes, et cetera. What I like about it a lot is that the messaging is incredibly simple. Like the film contest creates the guardrails around the messaging, right? So you will disqualify yourself from the film contest if you do a whole bunch of things that we know are not good in terms of suicide prevention, i.e. showing attempts or talking about committing suicide, using the word committing suicide, et cetera. I'm happy to talk about why later. But so there's sort of very strict guardrails around it. They're also, they have to show hopeful messages about kids getting help from each other, et cetera. Approaching each other, walking another kid over to the guidance counselor, et cetera, but they act that out, right? They script and storyboard, et cetera. And then because it's kid to kid, it really carries youth voice forward, right? So it's kids communicating to other kids about the ways in which they can help each other and not leave it just in the kid community, So it's one of my favorites. It also can open the door to suicide prevention programs more largely in schools. So I think a lot of schools are really scared to take on suicide prevention, and I don't blame them. It's not their first job. Their first job is kids learning. And yet by embedding it sort of in a creative class, in film class or in writing class, English class, or an after school club, sometimes the school says, oh my goodness, we need to do more of these kinds of programs. And then there are other ones that extend out from the sort of simple messaging that try to build strength and connection. There's something called sources of strength, where peer leaders are trained to build greater connections across a school, right? So kids have more support structures in schools, et cetera. But it can really open the door to other programs that might, require more of the school community to be involved.
Well, what I like so much about what you're saying is it sort of reminds me of some work that folks did at Columbia. And I work with adults with serious mental illness. And the approach was, well, how about we ask folks who have serious mental illness what helps and what hurts? Maybe they will have the expertise and the insight into what it is that we need to do, as a system to create both a supportive and healing environment for them. I think that's what you're kind of saying, is that there's a lot of guidance instead of just viewing kids as, well, they're kids, they're like the sort of the object of our concern, right? And but rather that if we're going to really make improvements in this area, the voice and experience of teens and young is going to be not just a nice thing to have, but may actually be a critical factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I ask my son a lot, and I ask my daughter's friends a lot, what do you think of this? And what's the, do you think this would resonate? Because, this is something that it's not like kids aren't talking about this with each other. They're talking certainly about mental health challenges in their own ways or struggles they're having. Asking kids themselves first, what would work for them, I think is incredibly important. Having suicide attempt survivors. These are people who struggle with suicidal thinking. I have myself not struggled with suicidal thinking. And so I can only surmise what that feels like. And I certainly relate to what my daughter, or try to relate to what my daughter was going through, but there's only so far I can go to that. Asking suicide attempt survivors what they think would help is a hugely important part of this process. And I think both suicide attempt survivors and youth, I think, are two groups we've largely left out of the conversation for too long. And I think that's especially true for this particular generation of kids, the Gen Z kids. I mean, they are, this is a set of kids that I watch, a lot. They were kids that were born in the wake of 9/11. They grew up in the context of, school shooting drills throughout their childhoods. Then they watched, climate change, calamity, all the way through to a huge amount of disruption of our, governmental institutions. And I worry then the result of all that is that they want to do things themselves. They want to take ownership and leadership in their world. And I think we need to give them a platform for that ultimately. And I think there's a huge amount of power that I think there's a huge amount of good we can do by sort of working with them and giving them some scaffolding and some supports to taking that on.
Well, I think, on that note, in terms of a main takeaway, which I think everyone who's on who works in a behavioral healthcare setting, it's a certain mindset, right? Of seeing kids as they can be a tremendously valuable source of guidance in what it is that we need to do in order to respond to their felt need. It really makes some sense. And so I think that's a really important takeaway from today.
Yeah, thanks.
We just want to make sure, let me turn this over. Lydia, if you're noticing, questions that are coming in that we might want to take from the audience.
Yes, we have a few questions that have come in as you've been talking. So let me just go through a couple of them. There's one or two related to speaking to caregivers, right? So one question is, as a mental health professional, how would you suggest having that conversation with a child that you believe is at risk, but they have a parent who is against talking about it or don't believe their child really needs a help? And in similar vein, there was another question related to how do you discuss suicidal ideation with caregivers? What are your thoughts there, Dr. Morris?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is it is the scariest thing for a parent to hear that their kid is suicidal. So I guess I would start by recognizing that it is traumatic to hear that your kid is suicidal, that, you've done everything to try to protect your child throughout their entire life. And here's something where you have no control over and you might lose your child. And I think starting by recognizing that and listening to parents' fears, I think is got to be where the conversation has to begin. Showing them kids who've really benefited from it. Maybe they've had their own, positive or not so positive experience with the mental health system. Maybe they've heard of other people who have not had good experiences. I think can all be things that might have limited people's appreciation for the value of the mental health system. Not to mention there's issues of cost, et cetera, right? But I think most importantly, listening to their fears as a starting point, I think is incredibly important. And recognizing that they probably can't hear half of what you're saying because they're scared. It is really scary.
Great, thank you, Dr. Morris. We have another question more related to the current experience with the pandemic and how, it's happening across the country, but also specific to New York State, because most of our providers work in the state. But with how severely COVID stress and lockdown has impacted the children's system of care in the state. So there's the amount of cases have overwhelmed crisis units, ERs. There's just an increase in mental health issues and people looking for help. So what are some creative adaptive options that you've heard that could help offset the mental health stress for clients and or to prevent the need for an inpatient stay?
I'm going to preface this by saying, listen, I'm not clinically trained. So in terms of, avoiding an inpatient stay, I'm actually going to sort of defer on that particular question. But I will say that you're absolutely right about COVID and its impact, both in terms of we've seen greater use of crisis lines. We've seen absolutely greater use of beds, not enough care providers out there. And I guess offering more families and others who are working with kids more information about how to support kids who are in need, I think can go a long way. There's these wonderful sites, and you all probably know this, about things you can ask or talk to, the ways you can talk to a kid who's suicidal, that I don't know, really have helped me when people have come to me and said, what do I say to my kid now? Or what do I say to my friend? I've sent them to some of these sites. Stacy Friedenthal has a wonderful site where she's got some blogs of like, how do you talk to a suicidal person? And just being there to listen is really important. Even if our mental health system was fully staffed, which it's absolutely not, a kid is only presumably going to be with a mental health provider for a limited time in a week. And so we'd still need to train parents and siblings and friends and other adults in kids' lives to be able to sit and listen to a kid, and sort of carry them through those really, really hard moments. That, like I said, most of it is about listening, and not trying to solve the problem, right? And those are two things. Not trying to solve the problem is probably one of the hardest lessons for a parent. How to just listen and hear your child in pain and not try to fix it for them, but try to see whether you can continue to offer suggestions for fixing it or help them figure out what helps them fix it. Which are all the things I think you all are probably doing in a lot of your sessions as well. But COVID is going to be rough for kids for a long time, not just the initial social isolation that happened during COVID, but all of the loss that happened and the aftermath of that loss. Even as kids sort of start to try to re-engaging socially and academically, I think it's going to be, I think we're going to feel the reverberations for a while, actually.
Terrific.
I think we have some folks who wanted you to repeat the name of some of the blogs or some of the resources, if you can
Yes.
share them. And we have a few folks asking for those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I said Desiree Stage, she Living Through This is her a project. It's wonderful. Stacy Friedenthal has something called speakingofsuicide.com. She has a set of blogs on it. It's a wonderful resource, actually at the bottom of my New York Times piece. Dr. Tony mentioned Michael Lindsay's work, of course, which one should always look at for sure around Black youth suicide. And I mentioned the film program. So directingchange.org. On it, there are the kids' films, so you can look at them and share them. They are freely available resources, actually, for people to use in their communities as well. And they are kid-made films, and they have the winning ones up there. They just ran their spring contest. And so hopefully those are some of the spaces you may want to go to.
Great, thank you. And we have someone who was asking, when they recommend to their child to sort of participate in certain services or access some of this information, they don't want to, they just refuse. But it sounds like something like maybe the film project could be one way of engaging youth that may be reluctant in trying sort of the traditional approach, and talking with people to really kind of help broaden some of their learning and understanding. So I think those are wonderful resources. Thank you.
Yeah.
I did have somebody that was asking about your public health approach. And New York State varies widely, and there's rural areas, there's urban areas, and all in between. And so they're wondering if you have any thoughts around how a public health approach may look in a more rural area, like some of our upstate counties, versus an urban area. Do you see a difference, or any thoughts to any way that approach can maybe look a little differently depending on the community?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, it's about speaking, listen, you're most likely to hear things from the people in your own communities. And so what that means is that I'm not sure that the approach would be different, i.e. you might still have public service announcements, but who's behind, what the communication is in those public service announcements, how does it resonate with the local community, I think is incredibly important. One of the reasons why I like that California program so much is that the kids are making their films for the community that they knew and grew up in. So, in fact, we're trying to raise money right now to actually launch it in New York State, and we were purposeful, if we're to raise money in doing so, in involving rural communities as well as urban communities in that, because we want kids who are living in rural communities to be able to speak to other kids in those rural communities, and they may speak, they may emphasize different, they may show different things in their films or different experiences that will resonate with their peers, that that a kid living in New York City might be very different from a kid living in New York City. So I guess that's the way I would think about it, to some extent, is tailoring by having the messenger be different, and involving people locally in those discussions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Morris. I think,
We're just about,
Yeah.
Lydia, I think we're just about out of time. I think what I always like to sort of think of at the end of a discussion like this, a call to action, right? Like, so now what do I do? Because right now, maybe I go to another webinar, I have a client I got to see, and it's just like in the day-to-day, activities that we all have. But I think one thing might be for some folks who are listening to this is when I go back to the office or another Zoom meeting, perhaps to continue this conversation, to say, look, let's, and we haven't really talked about it very much, right, in a while. Let's just kind of think about how we approach this issue. How do we create healing environments? How do we engage the young people in eliciting their perspectives and their suggestions and recommendations? How do we ensure that kids have a variety of creative outlets to express themselves, as opposed to let's sit and chat, that sort of thing. So that's what my hope would be, is that some of the folks who've been on this, that you can have an opportunity to continue this conversation and really elevate it to like another level in terms of how we as a system, and also are we connected to any of the other systems of schools and healthcare services and pediatrics and those sorts of things that one may not have really thought about before, that there are potential partners that can play a role in this. So anyway, that's sort of like what I would hope. But thank you so much, Dr. Morris, for sharing your perspective, both from the lived experience and your professional perspective, and bringing that together is really a special contribution. So thanks again. We wish you well, and we appreciate your contribution to our series.
No, thank you so much. Anybody who has follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And Tony, we just wanted to refer to a couple upcoming webinars. So in particular, related to this topic, in July, we're going to have two-part series on clinical implications related to the Black youth suicide increasing trend. So we'll specifically focus on that in July. That announcement is coming out, and or check our ctacny.org website. And we also have a number of other, related offerings to the work that we do in the mental health field around social determinants, educational advocacy, and additional treatment approaches. So, but please check out our website, ctacny.org, and also stay tuned to our email announcements. There is a feedback survey linked in the chat. If you can complete that now as you log off, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Okay, everyone, stay well.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.